For Latin and Ancient Greek, what is the best way to learn these languages? Why do the traditional methods not work? Or do they? Why don't we challenge that? Why don't we challenge the traditional methods with the more direct approach? Let's learn today exactly why input is so important and why focusing on grammar and translation can actually be harmful to your language learning experience, not just for Latin and Ancient Greek, but for any language. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. On the video that came out a little while ago on the Ranieri-Roberts approach to learning Ancient Greek, I told you how you can effectively, not necessarily efficiently, but effectively learn Ancient Greek by reading a whole bunch of graded readers, and I put them in an order, and you should definitely see that video for essentially the order that I recommend, or an order that could possibly work for you to put all these books together and have a very positive experience when trying to learn to become a fluent reader of Ancient Greek. But I got some really interesting comments that challenged the whole idea, not just of that particular approach, but the idea of using input to learn a language. And I really appreciated these comments because they give us the chance now to learn exactly why input, reading input, if you want to learn how to read, is just so important. Now, one of these comments, and I can't find it anymore, unfortunately, and I don't know if it was deleted or if it just went away, but one of these comments said that, why would you waste your time learning about the travails of Dicaeopolis or Julius or Marcus or Philippos when those have nothing to do with Plato or Cicero or Ovid or Menander or Sappho or whoever you want to actually read? That's just wasting time, so the person said, to read these things that aren't the original, when the goal is to read the original. If you want to read the original, just open the original. Hey, that's too hard for you? Okay, well then there are these things called grammar translation textbooks, traditional textbooks, traditional just for the past 200 years, but we'll call them traditional. Traditional textbooks that teach you, okay, this is how the genitive case works and the nominative case and the dative. These are how verb conjugations work. And you get to see those things in the context of original sentences from Xenophon or from Plautus or from Virgil or whatever ancient author you want, and then you get to learn the different morphology and the grammar rules, and of course vocabulary along the way too. So this person was opining that that is the better approach because it's more direct to what you want. And the thing that I call the direct approach, and is in fact the actual direct approach, which is input-based, where you get input through reading and listening and speaking and hearing and all these things, that is considered to be a waste of time. So I really appreciated this comment because it summarizes pretty well a notion that's still pretty common in the classics community today, and also was extremely strong for modern languages until just the past 20, 30, 40 years, where we've seen things like French in action and destinos, which are these great examples of putting communicative learning approaches into effect. That is, where you're not concentrated on building morphology and grammar at the expense of just communicating meaning. So before the 19th century, the older tradition of teaching any foreign or ancient language was by communicating meaning. And it, of course, involved understanding the language when it was spoken to the students and learning to speak in it and write in it and become fully fluent and competent in the language. This was true for all languages, modern and ancient, as the general principle. But in the 19th century and the 20th century, what we now call the traditional method was to focus instead on the grammatical rules, make those important, memorize paradigms as sort of the guiding principle throughout the whole learning experience, and not bother with any form of communication, certainly no expression on the part of the students, and then just somehow the language would be acquired by the student. And that doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. They can definitely teach you some things to help you cope with situations. Say if you're just learning the grammar of French and some vocabulary that you try to memorize, and then you go to France, well, then you would have some ways of coping with some things, you would have some familiarity, but that would have been much less effective than teaching the person French in a communicative way, where the person understands how to respond to the French language, would be spontaneously able to produce meaning with their voice or with their writing in order to interact with other speakers of the French language. So what we have to talk about here is the input hypothesis of second language acquisition. And of course, Krashen is this really famous guy who pioneered a lot of these ideas about 4 or 5 decades ago. And thankfully, a lot of modern languages took this to heart, or a lot of the courses did around the world, but not all of them. And this is also something that has occurred more recently in the teaching of Latin and ancient Greek and in other ancient languages, which is really fantastic. Now, why it's fantastic is because it's essentially the discovery through experimental evidence and data establishing the fact that learning through the grammar translation methods are far less effective, not even by a little, but extremely less effective by comparison to learning through communicative approaches. People who are not native speakers of English, say Europeans, for example, they might want to learn English someday. Now, in some countries in Europe, it's very common to watch native language English programming in television and movies without even subtitles, and certainly without any dubbing. Whereas in other European countries, dubbing is the norm for movies that come out of, say, Hollywood or things like that. And what's very interesting is basically the contrast of when you try to speak English with a Swede or an Italian. Now, obviously, there's a lot of similarity between the Germanic languages, which can help. But ultimately, the reason that Scandinavians tend to speak English with sometimes very regularly with a very proficient sounding accent and also highly communicative, whereas people from, say, Spain or France or Italy don't tend to communicate nearly as well, is not because the languages are different, but because of the amount of exposure to input, certainly from an early age, but basically just the hundreds, the thousands of hours that have gone into listening and acquiring the language. And then, of course, through reading and so forth, that becomes much easier. And that's just anecdotal, but the actual studies have been done by people like Krashen and Bill Van Patten and many others who have demonstrated that, no, in order to acquire language, you actually have to get input, and you have to get comprehensible input at that, and you need a lot of it. And these things about grammar rules, they can be helpful, especially in refining output, but putting them first often actually slows down the acquisition of language, or is in fact much more harmful than that. The advantages that they bring are radically outweighed by simply giving input in their place and leaving the grammatical explanations as something secondary. Now, in this video, I'm going to get into a lot more about why input is so important and why it's actually absolutely essential if you want to acquire any language, ancient or modern. But before I go any further, I want to tell you about this video sponsor, which you may already know, and that is Link. Link is this incredible website, and you can use it on your phone, you can use it on the computer, made by Steve Kaufman. Steve Kaufman and I, we had an interview. You can see the interview. It's here on this channel on polýMATHY. And it's so important to be able to get input, but how do you get enough input that's really properly targeted and at your level? Because we're talking about comprehensible input in this video as well. And that's something that Link can do because you are able to use all the content that's there, which is already thousands of hours for 40 plus languages. And with whatever form of content you have or import into it from YouTube or Netflix, etc., you're able to isolate vocabulary and understand everything and keep track of what you're doing and what you're learning and review things that you might be fuzzy on in a way that, well, there's no one that does that better that I've ever seen. It's fantastic.
Es sobre Miguel, que trabaja en un restaurante. Miguel se levanta a las 6 todas las mañanas, prepara el desayuno y se toma un café.
Here you can see how you can keep track of the vocabulary that you're learning and label it as a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or 4 or even completely learned.
Esto es un libro de color rojo. Hay edificios grandes, 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 muy grandes. Y también hay edificios pequeños.
Just like in some other approaches I've talked about, like how to do extensive reading and the multiple step method that I talked about in this video, or how to do the Ranieri-Roberts approach to ancient Greek and stuff like that. The point is to try to make things more comprehensible, but when you have a YouTube video that's in Spanish, how do you make that comprehensible in a way that's effective? And that's what Link can actually do for you. So if you sign up for the 12-month plan, you already get 30% off, no matter what. If you use the link that's in the description, you get an additional 5% off. So that's 35% off of the 12-month plan. And that's if you upgrade too, if you already have Link, which is pretty cool. And the reason I'm so fond of Link is because you can get the input you need for these languages. Input that's otherwise, even if you can access it, isn't necessarily as manageable as you want. So that takes us to the idea of comprehensible input. Something really important that's come out of the past half century of research on this is that language acquisition only happens when input is comprehensible, when meaning is understood. That's all it means. That's not that complicated of an idea, but it's actually pretty startling how often input, if it even exists in a curriculum, isn't comprehensible. And the ways in which there are attempts to make it comprehensible actually block the ability to acquire the language, namely through the grammar translation methods. So let's talk about what language acquisition is. Krashen likes to define language learning as something very different from language acquisition. And that everyone's goal really is language acquisition. They really want to be able to read fluently in their target language. They want to be able to understand fluently spoken target language content, or have interactions with native speakers or other fluent speakers of the language and understand what's going on. That's language acquisition. So learning is probably, I'd prefer to say learning about the language, because learning is a somewhat amorphous and means a lot of different things. Learning about a language, for example, if we're learning about Latin, then we have to learn about the grammatical forms of the verbs. The verb endings, they have certain order. We like to put them in those paradigms. We made a whole video about what's the better order of the cases. Should it be nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and so forth, or should it be nominative, vocative, accusative? That's all learning about language. And there's absolutely value in learning about language. This is basically the difference between riding a bike and being able to learn how to build a bike or a car or an airplane, whatever one you prefer. I like airplanes. Let's use airplanes. So when you learn how to fly an airplane in any flight school worth its salt, the first thing you're going to do is, just like in a driving school or learning to ride the bike, you're going to have the experience of some assisted riding of the bike. You're going to get the input of that experience. Your parents might be helping to hold the handlebars. You may be driving with a sibling who knows, an older sibling who already knows how to drive and is there to help you as you get your permit. So you're able to, learn some of those basics there. And if you're flying an airplane, then you get the instructor who takes you up, makes you learn how to go left and right, ascending and descending, all those things. I think there's something really intuitive about that which helps understand language, that if you use one of those things, whichever one you prefer, that it makes sense to see what the experience of driving is. The learning about those things would be learning, well, how do you build a bike? How do you construct? Like, what kind of screws do you use? What is the manufacturing process, the metallurgy in the metal for the car or the airplane? What is the physics behind how you're actually able to stay suspended in the bike or the airplane or turn in a car and so forth? What's going on there with all forces and friction and all these really cool things? And from a physics perspective, that's all fascinating. But almost none of that is important to make you a better rider of a bike or driver of a car or pilot of an airplane. There are definitely a lot of very technical things you have to learn about being highly proficient. For example, if you want to be a very proficient athletic rider, what are those called? So BMX or something on the bikes. Or if you want to be a stunt driver. Or if you want to be, the pilot. You want to be pretty proficient in your technical ability. But still, those technical things, so understanding of exact physics concepts of the atmosphere are still much less important than simply knowing how to land and doing that intuitively and understanding the input of the situation and responding to it accordingly. So learning grammatical rules is comparable to learning about the physics of the bike and why when you turn it moves this way, why you have to, to lean in. It gives you some conscious way of understanding of why, if you do things the wrong way, then you'd fall, why you'd crash the car, why the airplane would spontaneously explode. They don't actually do that. I'm just kidding. That is learning about the language. That's learning about the system of cases, about the morphology, about the verb conjugations, about the order of adjectives and so forth, and learning that in a very conscious way. The amazing discovery of these past 4 to 5 decades of research is that within our brains, within our minds, our human minds, there is some sort of language acquisition device. And all sorts of amazing things have gone into the understanding of the neurology of this, but it's still rather mysterious in the sense that we know that children grow up and they're able to pick up a language and learn it. And also adults are able to pick up languages quite fluently, sometimes to native level proficiency. And this happens why? And we know that this happens due to comprehensible input. That's the whole hypothesis, and it's been proven out again and again by the actual test data, demonstrating that what you need is to have the experience of receiving messages you understand in the target language. So to respond to the first comment that, again, I wasn't able to show because I couldn't find it. I think it's on that video, but it was really good and really made me think and want to respond to the idea, well, why don't you just get the traditional grammar book, like say I don't know, Wheelock's for Latin, which isn't even that bad compared to a lot of them. And that way you get sentences that are right from context, and you learn this part of the morphology and that part of the morphology and this and that. The reason is that you then learn the skill of translation. You learn enough about the language to perform a skill of language translation. And translation is amazing and fascinating, but it's a separate skill from language acquisition and doing other things you want to do in that language, which usually involve simply speaking or writing. So while it may seem that getting the traditional 19th or 20th century textbook for Latin or ancient Greek that teaches a grammatical concept and then shows you example sentences, often taken directly from ancient literature, and then gives you the piece of Xenophon, and then gives you the piece of Cicero, and then you have the exercise of translating it to see if you understand it. That's all backwards. Not only is it a waste of time when it comes to language acquisition, but it's actually harmful. Now, why is that harmful? And the reason is because you interact with the language from day one, not in any way that's going to get you to language acquisition. You'll start to get this idea about the language that really isn't the language. Often, even teachers might believe that language is a set of rules, of grammatical concepts, vocabulary to learn. That's the traditional idea, this traditional method that is attempting to make things easier, but it actually makes things much harder because especially when you're dealing with translation, you get the idea that, in order to understand Latin, I need to understand any given vocabulary word in English or Italian or German or whatever your native language is. And Randall Booth had a great talk about this. I definitely recommend seeing it. I'll link it below. Where if you are constantly focused on translating any given sentence of Greek or Hebrew or whatever it is in the ancient language, this is still very common in ancient languages, which is why I'm picking on it. What you do is you make reading, real reading, impossible. What is reading then? Reading is where you're able to look at a sentence and you cannot help but understand the meaning right away. If it's your native language, if you see something written, you can't help it. You can't help but just instantly, as long as you understand all the words, they are words you know, and you understand the grammar, and everything about that is a normal set of words and phrases, even though the information is otherwise new. If you can understand it, you will not be able to help. But if it's describing, you're right. So, right, it's a good example. You all can speak English, hopefully. If you're understanding me, you're there. Great. The lion walked down to the watering hole, and there was a gazelle. And the gazelle looked at the lion, and the lion went, and the gazelle ran off, and then there was a chase. Let's hope the gazelle got free. As I said that, and if you had read it in writing, you would have been able to immediately see all of those images because you understand written English fluently. And this is the exact same thing we can do in languages that we know how to read fluently. I could do that and see all those images instantly in Italian, and as long as I understood every word, it would be no problem. I could do the same thing in Latin, ancient Greek, and a number of the languages that I've had the opportunity to study through the years. That's the goal. That's fluent reading. That is, perhaps better said, that is what reading is. And insofar as we get to a word that we don't understand, then we're going to be blocked, and we'll have to learn that word, hopefully from the context. We'll be able to figure out what it says and then acquire the word in that fashion. But if not, if we only understand a couple of the words like and is and plus the word and, then maybe the word ran, you only get some of those, but if you don't know the other words, and if your intuition has been trained, if your skill is to see every word and then realize it into the version that corresponds to your native language, then you wouldn't get any of that right away. You would be creating a completely different activity, which is translation. And even if you could do it in writing, but if you do it spontaneously, if you're trained to see all these things like leo ad arrivum versus ambulat tum aliud animal videns, you hear all these, you read all those things, you're able to see, then you translate, okay, the lion walking down towards the river, towards the stream, and so you keep putting it into your own language. You will be understanding meaning, but not from the target language. That's not actual true reading. And that's why it's so important to be able to hear the sounds of the language, read words, and hear the sound in your own head. And that, in the phonological loop, which I've talked about elsewhere and Booth talked about in that video, you then comprehend the language. Meaning is happening. And that is, by the way, the only way that language is acquired. So if you study the grammar books really well, and they're then able to, take out some Plato, and you have the skill of translating it. You have the skill of understanding some of the vocabulary, maybe even a lot of it. But ultimately, it's not hitting you the way it would in your native language, or even a language that you might know how to read fluently. It's simply not reading. It's something else. Now, if that's satisfactory to you, well, I'm not going to knock that. But you're not really going to be appreciating the language, because this is literature that was meant for native speakers or for people who were fluent speakers in these ancient periods. And ditto, by the way, great literature of any modern language. So we have to acquire any language in order to be able to read fluently in it, and of course, if we want to be able to understand it spoken to us, or if we want to be able to speak it ourselves, write in it, and so forth, we have to acquire it, not just translate. And this is why Dicaeopolis and Julius and Aemilia and Melita and all of these characters have some kind of value, because we want to be able to learn how to read fluently. In ancient languages, the goal primarily is to read fluently, and we can often get there with the assistance of hearing it and speaking it. Actually, that can help a huge amount, but I'm not going to concentrate too much on that in this video. The point is that graded readers like Via Latina or the Cambridge Latin course, or the Familia Romana, of course, which is extremely famous, or of the Athenaze series, or Thrasymachos, or of the Alexandros, or any of these readers that you've heard me talk about over the years, the reason that these are valuable, they allow language acquisition to happen much more readily. They are not a waste of time, because in order to acquire language, you simply have to get input that you understand. Thus, they are graded starting with really simple sentences. Roma in Italia est, Dicaeopolis Athenaeus estin. We get those really simple sentences, and if they're made comprehensible for us, they allow us to acquire the language. So that's where the value is in them. And then eventually we progress. If we're guided by a teacher or on our own, or however we're doing it, we progress to the point where we can pick up an original work in the ancient language of our choice. It could be the Vulgate Bible in Latin, the original New Testament in Greek, any of these things of classic or ancient literature, and understand what's going on. That's the communication. That's the goal, and we get there through comprehensible input. So thank you, whoever asked that question. If it helped, let me know. If it didn't, and if you have follow-up questions or rebuttals, please let me know in the comments. There was another comment on the Ranieri-Roberts approach to ancient Greek video that I really like because it challenged a lot of these ideas, and I'm going to read some excerpts from it. This person said, I disagree about the first thing you said is good about Athenaze. As a language learner, I would just hate a textbook that requires me to struggle through a text without first having been given the toolkit that is necessary to understand it. Oh, and okay, so this is really this is an interesting and important on a few levels. One of them is the fact that books like Athenaze, for all of their virtue, as I said in that video, I was very critical of a number of the books I mentioned in that video that I was still recommending as part of that approach. They're worthy of this criticism, I think, because they don't do comprehensible input very well. The first sentence of Athenaze is Dicaeopolis Athenaeos estin, oike deho Dicaeopolis ukentais Athenaes, allentuis agrois, auturgos garestin. So that means several things. Dicaeopolis is an Athenian, but Dicaeopolis doesn't live in Athens. He lives in the country, since he's a farmer. Okay, so it throws so much stuff at you, and even the Vivarium Novum edition, which has more pictures and it tries to make this more comprehensible, it's a shocking difference from the very first page, especially when you compare it with something that is definitely much more comprehensible, like the beginning of Familia Romana. You get a beautifully illustrated map of Europe in the 2nd century AD of the Roman Empire, and we learn Roma in Italia est, Italia in Europa est. I mean, that's 2 sentences now, not one. And we have other countries like Hispania and Graecia, and we learn these things, and the vocabulary is pretty easy to acquire, as well as the basics of the grammar of is and are and in. Those are the morphological and grammatical points that are focused on in that first chapter. So you're right, person who made this comment, that it is, for some of these, a struggle. And where it's a struggle, well, that's not the kind of experience we want to give. Yeah, we have to be really focused on learning things in a very concentrated way in the beginning. We have to, ideally with pictures, or with some other way that is fully comprehensible, we learn these vocabulary terms for man and woman, and for girl and boy, and all these things, and the dog and the wolf and the cat. And we learn all these things little by little with pictures, and the verbs they do, like running or singing or laughing or crying or hitting. And we learn them in this context that is clear per se. That's the per se illustrata in Familia Romana, lingua latina per se illustrata. That is through itself clear on its own, doesn't need any other language or any help. Which is another part about language acquisition, that whatever you learn, ideally it's through the input of the language itself. For example, even if you're learning something arguably less useful in the input hypothesis, like, say, the details of how to use the genitive case or something, if you're learning in the target language, if it's being explained to you in the target language, it's much more effective and much more helpful. You actually retain it much more effectively. So, commenter, you're right. If it's a struggle, I understand why you'd want to learn the grammar first. And if the grammar is the only way to make comprehensible what you're reading, well, then it's the textbook that's wrong, not the notion of having input before a grammatical explanation. Our commenter went on to say, why should I be forced to guess what the grammar is like before I'm given the real explanation? This is not even a real imitation of the supposed natural way of learning either, since I do get a theoretical explanation after the text. It's just more cumbersome. Again, I see what you're saying. The idea is that ultimately you get input that's comprehensible. So the way you can use something like Athenaze, which is far from ideal, or many of these other textbooks that I talked about in the Ranieri-Roberts approach video, is that you utilize whatever you got. Dictionaries, translation, you use the grammatical explanations at the end of the chapter. Eventually, you need to be able to read that chapter multiple times, but need to at least get to one point where you read it and you understand everything. Meaning is communicated to you, and you can visualize everything. Or if you're using some audio version of any of this material, Latin or Greek or whatever, you're able to understand what's being said or what's being read, and we'll concentrate on the reading since that's the focus. The commenter goes on to say, but the whole ambition to learn languages in the natural way is a profoundly misguided pedagogical fashion in any case. As adults, we can't learn languages in the thoughtless, intuitive way a child does, or in the way some people manage to learn just by communicating in real life, typically acquiring a very faulty form of the language. Okay, this is a very interesting idea. Again, I really thank you for writing this all out like this, because it captures very well the opposing viewpoint. So I'm glad I get this chance, of course, is my channel, to respond to this idea, because the notion that we as adults should learn anything like children learn a language seems on the face of it to be, whoa, that can't possibly be right. You're talking about L1 and L2. L1, your first language, and L2, second language. L1 and L2 clearly have something very different in their environment, right? You have the mapping for the first time of all the complexities of language, all the difficulties and power of self-expression of the individual learning the language and everyone else that individual, that child, is trying to understand and learning from. You have all that going on for a number of years during the cerebral development of the child and into adulthood, right? So that's first language acquisition. Second language acquisition, whenever it starts, depending how early, elementary school, depending on where that starts, maybe rarely, middle school, more frequently high school, college, adult level, is different in environment. But what's so interesting that all of these studies demonstrate is that even though there's no doubt there's a lot of differences, the language acquisition device that's in the brain, and that acquisition happens through input, through comprehensible input, it's not a fashion, it's not a fad. It is through all of the data collected and through all of the evidence we have, it is how languages are learned. There is no way around it. There is no, I'm going to do the more efficient thing and just study the grammar and translate things. That doesn't work. It doesn't actually end up in acquiring the language and being able to read it fluently or understand it being spoken at you fluently. The biggest difference with the L1 and L2 is that L1, you have all the motivation. You want to actually be able to communicate with the people around you. You want to be able to understand them and eventually speak to them. And you're just bombarded with input, hundreds of thousands of hours, however long the amount of hours of 5, 10, 15 years, and you just can't help it. But what's amazing is that if you get comprehensible input as an adult, you can actually get really good at your L2 to very high levels of proficiency, even native-like in several situations when it comes to idiom and pronunciation and all kinds of things. All of that is readily possible with the right tools. But if we're just concentrating on learning to read the ancient language, there's no faulty pedagogical fashion. It's not misguided. This is the way, the only way to acquire language, including reading. Our commenter continues, this kind of approach seems intended to appeal to most non-bookish individuals who don't like to think and reason very much and wish things could just come intuitively to them. If you've met people like that, commenter, who espouse this method, well, okay, that's fine. I count myself as pretty bookish. If you've seen my multi-hour discourses where I actually analyze pedagogical research on ancient phonology, for example, on polýMATHY Plus on the secondary channel, then you probably think of me as reasonably bookish. I hope so. I like bookish people. I like non-bookish people. When it comes to language acquisition, it doesn't matter. This is not promoted by people who are non-bookish, because the researchers are some of the best in the field who have dealt with this subject. So it's not fashion. It's not because it's a non-bookish thing. If that's your impression, that's fine, but it's just not representative of the reality of linguistics or pedagogy. Our commenter continues, I don't think it can deliver, meaning, I suppose, comprehensible input theory or natural methods of learning. I don't think it can deliver what it promises to them. If they don't learn to apply the rules that are explained to them, they just won't learn the language properly. So the evidence has demonstrated that this is simply not correct, that you can learn how to master these rules, but it's learning a separate skill that's not necessarily, in fact, often not very closely related at all to the actual language acquisition thing. And that is about the exchanging of meaning. Can you express meaning, and can you, especially when it comes to the ancient languages, can you absorb the meaning through listening to it, or more likely through reading it? Can you read it without having to resort to the translation of anything in your own head? Can you read it much as you could read your own native language? Maybe not quite that fast. You can be a little bit slower. We all have different reading speeds depending on time of day, the difficulty of what we're reading and so forth, but it shouldn't be beyond something that we can do in a fluent way, right? So the notion that language is a set of grammatical rules and vocabulary is a simplified description, and it's incorrect. It's a little bit like the Bohr model of the atom, where you have the nucleus in the center and we see electrons going around it like the planets. Or if we think of that, in the solar system, you have the suns in the middle and the planets revolve around it. And they do so in circles. We think of that as a basic, simplified way of understanding it. And that's not descriptive of the reality. Yeah, it gives you some picture, it gives you some help. Oh, yeah, it's helpful to know, okay, the planets are in this order, there's Mercury and Venus and Earth and Mars, and they're roughly the same distance between them. You can learn that. And that they go in these orbits that look like circles. But in that simplified explanation, there's nowhere telling you that the sun is also orbiting around the Earth and exactly where that center of gravity, if you will, is located. The Bohr model of the atom shows you the electron shells, but it doesn't tell you at all the reality of what electrons are really doing inside the atom, which is way more complex. Those are simplified explanations of things, and they have their utility, but they don't necessarily describe reality. In fact, they don't describe reality at all. This is a much better representation of the reality of grammar. And this is what's really going on in language. This is the looking under the hood, and if it's scary, it should be, unless you're a linguist, in which case have fun with all of that. That's what language is really doing. It's incredibly complex, much, much, much more complex than you would think based on the neat little grammatical rules that we have in the textbooks. Those are just the way to simplify to the very superficial thing of what's happening on the surface. But they end up being false way more than you would think if they were really rules. Something else you said, they just won't learn the language properly. It's actually the opposite. The concentration on grammar translation, if we're just talking about an ancient language, Latin or ancient Greek, the focus on those rules ends up not preparing us for the exceptions to the rules, because what's really going on under the hood, metaphorically speaking, what's really going on in the mechanics is actually something way more complicated than almost anyone wants to deal with when they want to acquire language. Linguistically, we can understand the enormous and extraordinary complexity of what's going on. A good example might be something like café in Spanish, which is something you can drink, but it's also a cafe, right? And how when we read the word read, well, it could also be read. It could be present or past tense. They look the same. Or that read, the sound, could be the color or could be the past tense of the verb. Now, all these things are linked in incredibly complex ways, neurologically and basically in our internal grammar, in ways that can be simplified into these superficial categories of verb and past tense and so forth. That's not the reality, though. That's just a way of simplifying the reality in ways that can help us consciously follow what's going on. But the point of language acquisition is that we don't actually have to follow that, and that if we over-concentrate on that, we will be continuously hindered by our expectations of a grammatical system or vocabulary terminology not being met, essentially. You say here, and it also hinders those of us who are not, in fact, so averse to thinking and reasoning. I love thinking about grammar. I'm super into linguistics. I love reasoning about why this term means this and the etymology of that. I have a whole series on etymology on this channel. All of that is really interesting, and it brings a lot of value. But they're still always peripheral at best to acquiring language, acquiring the ability to read fluently in the case of, say, ancient languages. And speaking them too, so why would you even bother to speak with them? That is so that you can interact entirely within the language in the classroom, for example. Or you can discuss with the teacher anything about the text, talking about the rhythm, the music, the literature, because you want to. The thing that's really important about this is the ancient literature is written for people who are fluent in the language. Speaking fluency, certainly reading fluency. So if you don't have that same ability or something approaching it, then you simply will never be capable, ever, of appreciating the literature in the way that was intended. It'll be a shadow only. You go on to say, as their commenter person, personally, when I encounter one of these textbooks, like Athenaze, that places the texts, the reading, before the grammar points, I automatically go to the grammar points first and then turn the page back to the text. I get it. You were trained in this grammar-first method, and that's a way for you to access the languages. And that's a shame, because if instead you'd been given this second language acquisition model of comprehensible input, you would intuit that you need to get the input first. You need to give that language acquisition device in your brain the chance to absorb the information, deal with the ambiguities. That's the thinking. That's the reasoning that's going on. And it's super complicated. It's more complex than we can consciously understand. Allow that to happen. And then to have a grammatical explanation that follows, especially if it's in the target language. Familia Romana is a great example of this. Logos does this as well. Then you're able to stay within the language at least, and then you have a chance to absorb some of those grammatical rules, or they can help to crystallize in a conscious way what you're supposed to be understanding if it's a text that's based primarily on grammatical points like logos, like Familia Romana, and so forth. So thank you so much for this comment, because it is representative, I think, of a lot of the points of view of folks in the classics field. If I did not satisfy your questions and your comments here with my answers, I'd love to hear from you again, or other people out there who have similar points of view. I really like having these this kind of discussion. And I have another comment that I wanted to look at today. And this person asked, can pictures really be precise enough compared to translations? And that's a really good point. And this has to do not necessarily with the usage of pictures or of a teacher picking up a teleponum and you can see it and you have an idea of what that is and you hear the word and you understand what that's about. You bring up something like emojis and simplified drawings of things. A family picture could be labeled man, woman, boy, girl, or father, mother, son, daughter. Right, there'd be ambiguity. The way to clarify that ambiguity would be something like in the second chapter of Familia Romana, where we understand the family tree as there's these individuals and their relationships to one another respectively. And when we understand that, this other person is a boy or a girl, but that's not the daughter or the son of this individual, that's clarified in the text, then you realize, then you understand that important semantic difference in the context. So where you have a picture of an animal you've never seen before, like you mentioned here, if you see something and you can't tell what it is that a wolf or is that a fox? That's a really good point. So is it a vulpes or is it a lupus? And you can't tell, is that a feles or a leo? You're absolutely right. That could be very confusing. So the burden there is on the textbook or the teacher or whatever the medium is presenting the information to be as clear as possible, because this is about comprehensible input. If the meaning is misunderstood, then language acquisition isn't happening. That's a big complaint that goes to the Athenaze series as well, because, and for all its virtues, one of the things that is often criticized about the illustrations in the Vivarium Novum version is that they're all black and white, which is fine. The original Familia Romana was also just all black and white images. That's the one I used, and it was great. No problem. The problem is that the illustrations in the Athenaze series look like they were done quite large, and then they were shrunken down to be quite small. So they have lots of little lines in them, and often it's confusing or even hilarious what on earth this or that is supposed to be. I remember in one of the early chapters of Athenaze, Philippos is being kissed by his mother. So his mother's kissing him, and it's not really clear what's going on, and it's just kind of odd seeing it, and you don't necessarily know, what is this verb meaning? Is it meaning that the mother kisses Philip or loves Philip? And of course the verb means both, but that's another thing too that has to happen. These pictures have to convey something really important like that, because that's a really important thing too. We believe especially how we're educated by the meaning of words. These words have these kinds of specific meanings, especially if we're trained that way. When we learn our L2, we believe that words have a specific meaning. And it's not really true. Words often have a wide range of meanings. The Greek verb phileo, for example, phileo, in ancient Greek, that means I love. It's one of 3 verbs for love, but it also means I kiss. And it's from the noun philos, meaning friend. Actually, it means dear one. It's like garus in Latin. It's dear. That's what it means. So even the word dear means 2 things. When you hear dear, you have to understand from context, does that sound sequence correspond to the wild animal, or does it mean beloved? These are things that happen all the time in our heads, and it's extremely complicated. So how do we acquire vocabulary best is not with the precision of translation. That's more of a last-ditch effort just to save the comprehension if it's absolutely necessary. And it can be interesting because sometimes, for all one's attempts, something isn't perfectly clear. But think about all the times we learned more complicated vocabulary for native English speakers, and we were hearing it when we were growing up, and we misunderstood this term or that term, and then it became more clear over time with more input. That's what that means. This is what vocabulary really is. Vocabulary is potentially many meanings. The point is that we have to understand the meaning of words in context. Having pictures or video or audio or some kind of situation where when the teacher points over there and says tyra estin, or something. That's tyra. So what's a tyra? And you see a bunch of things over there. There's the wall, there's a window, there's a picture, there's a door, there's a chair. What is he doing? And then the teacher can say, prosten tyran erkomai. And then you see the teacher walking towards the door. And then you realize, tyra, could that be door? And then the teacher says, den tyran gruo. And they knock on the door, and then you have these different pieces of input, and you understand, okay, that's probably door. And as you get more pieces of input like that, where it's just audio and visual, you understand what's going on. Or if it's just reading, as long as you're able to read the letters, that's difficult. How do you teach a writing system that's not the Roman alphabet, for example? That's a whole other discussion. You can understand the meaning as intended. In reality, the picture is often much better if it's done well. It's not that hard to do it well, but some books do have trouble. One more comment I really liked, I want to read. My problem with ancient languages like Latin, Greek, ancient and Koine. Hold on, wait, I got to go over this. Koine Greek is ancient Greek. Ancient Greek has to do with the Greek that was written and spoken in antiquity. And that goes up roughly to the death of Justinian, 6th century AD. Koine, Gini, for you modern Greek speakers, go see this video and understand about the changing pronunciation of ancient Greek. Athenaze Familia. Ancient Greek is this enormous period of at least 8 centuries. So classical Greek is often distinguished from Koine Greek by a time period. So anything after the 4th century BC, that's Koine until the death of Justinian. And before that, it's considered classical for about a couple centuries. And before that, it's pre-classical, Homeric, epic, and some other things. So that's all ancient Greek. So like you said, my problem with ancient languages like Latin and Greek and Hebrew is that they're all focused on reading and understanding vocabulary. All is passive. I need workbooks to write in Latin and Greek to make progress, and all these books have very little of it. Okay, I really like this comment for a number of reasons. First response I have for you is that there's actually a lot of exercises. The Familia Romana books have these wonderful exercitia books that go with them. Athenaze has, there's a polýMATHY, so that go along with them as well, and there are exercises in the primary textbooks as well. There's lots of exercises. The ones that focus on translation, just to ignore those. Anything that does with at least translation from your native language into, say, ancient Greek, Athenaze has those. Those are more worth doing. And you want to get practice in writing and composition. I did talk about the ephemeris method over in this video. I do recommend looking at that. That's basically about giving yourself more input through composition. Go see it. It's worth seeing. So why do you want to write more in Latin and Greek? So that you make progress. I understand exactly how you feel, because one of my biggest interests, my motivations for acquiring Latin and ancient Greek is to be able to compose things in Latin and ancient Greek. It's been an exciting journey with Latin. I've composed stories, novellas, poems in Latin, and I've done a much smaller amount of that in ancient Greek so far, but it's really exciting. And there's a lot of value to that for writing works of literature, for the reason one would write any work of literature. It's really cool to participate in that experience with that ancient language. And it also is helpful to create pedagogical tools and all kinds of things. So I feel that progress is very interesting. You want to make progress. You want to feel like you're actually acquiring the language. And having the exercises to do that is giving you a test to confirm that you're acquiring the language. So one of the things I would say and have you consider is that if you trust this concept, and you don't have to trust it, you go read Krashen's papers, Bill Van Patten's books, you are acquiring language if you're getting the input, even though it is passive. Language acquisition, fundamentally, this is passive in the sense that you have to hear and read things. You need to get it from context. It has to be interesting, too. So all these things have to happen. But if you compose something, what you're doing is you're something original. Say you read, this is how you can do it, by the way. You read the first chapter of Athenaze. Write your own short composition using whatever vocabulary that's there about different characters, or even about your own life if you can. That's the best, I think, because it's real in a way that's motivating. Write about anything you can that works. For example, Athenaeus autorgos estin. He's a farmer, a self-made farmer. Are you? You could say arego autorgos, ukimi autorgos. Like I'm not. Then what you can do, using that ephemeris technique that I talk about, is you can then recite it aloud, record yourself saying it, and then listen back to it while you read it, and you're getting all the language disciplines at once, which is, of course, writing and speaking, but more importantly to input, hearing and reading. Composition, when it comes to the acquisition of language, is best there, where you're creating new things, but not for the sake of creating them necessarily for the transmission of meaning to someone else right now while you're learning, but to repeat things so that it's completely comprehensible to you because you wrote it. And the great thing is you can then go back to these journal entries you've made. I made a bunch in this thing. You saw it in that video, the ephemeris technique. You can go back to read your own things and then see you had to look up a vocabulary word for, I don't know, duck, but you forgot that. So when you read it again from context, just like in the good graded readers, you're able to remember the word. Acquiring vocabulary, grammar, all these superficial definitions of things that are part of language acquisition, getting all that takes repetition. It takes seeing the things again and again and again. So that's the value of composition. If these readers don't give you enough writing practice, use the ephemeris technique. So if this language acquisition input stuff is new to you, if you have questions, I'm a student of this, pedagogically speaking. I'm trying to learn what I can about this topic in order to be a better teacher and to be able to transmit these ideas, because I think they're really valuable, and they also help us to understand where textbooks, Athenaze we're just constantly picking on, or Logos or any of them, where they fall short and how they could be better in order to create yet better things for the next generation or better things for ourselves as individuals. All this is really interesting and important, and if you have completely opposite viewpoints, like some of the people that I was able to cite today, absolutely write them in the comments and we can continue this discussion. Thanks so much again to Link for sponsoring this video. Check out the link in the description. And thanks, as always, to each and every one of my Patreon supporters. Walete kai hygienete.